Now let's start the Sprint 67 review. Yeah, next slide.
Oh, sorry. Rusty.
So today I'll go over the Sprint statistics. Carol will give us a community update. I'll jump over to architecture, then we'll go to Dan on the classic UI, Chris on the service UI. Bronagh will be doing providers today. Tina will show us some automate stuff. Gregg T on the platform, Alberto on API, and wrap up with Chris on documentation. Next slide, please. So for the Sprint statistics, we had 447 closed PRs across 33 repos. The UI Classic seems to have jumped ahead of ManageIQ this time, which is pretty cool. As you can see, there was a breakdown among the others. No new repositories this week. I think this was kind of a light week, which maybe we'll see in the next slide. Well, I know a lot of people were taking some summer vacation, so next slide, please. The split among the types of PRs merged is pretty consistent. 32.8% bugs, there's 34.9% enhancements. The rest is a smattering. Pretty typical. Next slide, please. For the PR breakdown, it looks pretty consistent, I guess you can say. But we're going to continue to watch this over the sprints that come. Slide, please. For the health report, everything is pretty stable. There were quite a few issues that arrived in the OpenStack repo for some reason. But UI Classic seems to have kicked out a few more, 66 as you can see. So no surprises there. Next slide, please. Over to Carol.
Thanks, Jason. Is the audio okay?
Yes.
Great. All right. So it's a short update from me this time as well because I just got back from PTO and there's not too much major things going on. Although we did have a release. Fine 3 was released a couple of weeks ago, and then we have the usual last week in ManageIQ, well, the fortnightly editions by Drew Ullman and Jillian Twillow, and take a look if you haven't already, especially the one about limericks, quite cool with a video featuring Alan and everything. So check them out. And I think hopefully I'll have more information in a couple of weeks' time as I catch up on events and swag and a lot of cool stuff. So thanks for that. And next slide, please.
All right. On the re-architecture side of things, there wasn't very much going on. We are sort of wrapping up some of the design, I guess you could say, and more focusing on some of the implementation and proof of concept type work. In addition, a lot of people were on vacation. So on the platform side of things, I think one of the bigger things we figured out was Brendan and I got replication working across OpenShift installations. So if you set up two separate ManageIQ applications in two separate OpenShifts, or two apps in the same OpenShift, you can replicate Postgres using our global replication. Figured out a way to expose Postgres outside of the OpenShift cluster so that they can communicate with each other. That worked really well. So I had written up an email about that, and we're pretty happy with that. Gregg T worked on reducing the server-worker communication by moving the config broadcast to memcached. When the server launches workers, it sets up a DRB channel, and then when the worker heartbeats in, we send any possible config changes. We tell the worker over that communication that, hey, there's new config changes, go update your config. And it was done in a kind of complex way. So Gregg not only simplified it to make it just say update everything, but also he removed the DRB communication and made it go over memcache instead using, I believe, a timestamp stored in memcache. So the worker can just check to see if anything's changed, and if not, there it goes. So getting rid of the DRB communication is a big step towards eliminating or making it less complex to have that server process there. On the authentication side of things, Alberto worked on getting config maps for external auth and the rewrite rules. So the auth container is a dedicated container just for doing external auth, and its only responsibility is for handling the authentication and then forwarding off to our workers. So we need to be able to configure that, and we're going to use OpenShift config maps for that. If you're not familiar with config maps, basically they're just ways to mount the files into a container and keep that configuration outside of the container. So using that, he can set up all the external auth configuration in one place, and then when we start the container, we map it in, and off it goes. Same thing for the rewrite rules, things where basically an application, basically we've set it up that the auth container can be used by any application, not just our own. And you can inject your own overwrite rules, rewrite rules into the container, and then it'll know how to transfer control over to which service or pod or whatever. Finally, Nick L. worked on handling SIG-term properly in workers with the codified workers that Nick C. has been working on. We found that when Kubernetes wants to kill them, it sends a term signal, and we weren't handling that properly, and we were concerned that we would shut down the worker in the middle of doing some work without giving it a chance to gracefully recover. So Nick L. figured out how to handle that properly and got that in. On the provider side of things, not much work that really went in there except for continuing some of the existing stuff. I think the big thing was tying together the current collector persisters and ManageIQ messaging, so making the collector, when it collects things, send it to ActiveMQ Artemis through the ManageIQ messaging gem, and then the persister reading from ActiveMQ Artemis and actually persisting it to the database. And we proved that that whole flow can actually work. And one big place that Adam and Keenan worked on was for metrics. We eliminated the coordinator. So the coordinator was a process that wakes up every so often, decides which objects need to be collected, puts all those objects on the queue individually, and then the collector would read from the queue, process, and persist. Got rid of that entirely. The collector is now ultimately responsible for figuring out what it needs to collect, collects it, puts it on Artemis, and then the persister is dumb and just picks up from Artemis and writes it. And they got that working as well. So that's probably the direction we're going to go. It also makes all providers, all parts of providers, metrics, inventory, and events all the same, if you will. And that's it for the re-arch. Next slide, please.
All right, so on the classic UI side, I think the slide earlier showed a few more PRs than 90, but we'll try to line those counts up next time. You can see there's a lot of bugs fixed, and also a lot of work on technical debt and refactoring. Enhancements are moving along because we're trying to get the features in for the G release. On the refactoring side, a lot of the work is being done is trying to componentize things inside the UI for the UI spike. So a lot of that is happening. Also some cleanup to get rid of some of the global constants that we had before, trying to move them into the appropriate areas. Tree Builder is one of those components that we're trying to make to help with the spike, to help componentize the product so it's a little more pluggable. And ongoing work to get the JavaScript controllers closer to Angular 1.6 so that they'll be compatible with 2.0. Really just getting them all to use controller as, get rid of the dollar scope stuff. On the enhancement side, work on putting back the colors for the custom buttons in the toolbars. We have the ability now to show custom buttons based on expressions. So that's pretty cool. So now you used to put a custom button on an object type and it would always show up regardless of whether the state of that type, whether it's a VM that's running or not. Now you can actually put any kind of expression on there to determine whether the button is shown, first of all, and then whether or not it's enabled or disabled, along with the text that says why it's not enabled. Widget menus and widget reports, what this is moving towards Angular components, and really what we're trying to do here is get our two different dashboards in line and working the same way with Panterfly components. So this was part of the work, is getting the original main menu dashboards into components. They're making the widgets into components so that we can get them the same way as the other Panterfly dashboards, which we're also working on. So you'll see that coming soon. And then Madhu in the Automate team added the expression editor, and then we cleaned up the styling and stuff. So you can now have an Automate method that is basically based on an expression. So, next slide, please. Couple screenshots here. Colors are back, so that's nice. There's a little test. If you can look really close there, you can see that test button there is disabled, and there's a little hover text that says why it's disabled. So you can basically, like I said, use any expression based on any elements of the object that you're currently looking at to determine whether or not a button is shown or hit or disabled. Next slide. And this is where Madhu put in the Automate expression. The expression editor into the Automate methods. So now there's a type of it called expression, and you can put any kind of expression in there as well. So you can use the expression editor inside an Automate method. And that, I think, is it. Next slide, please. There you go, Chris.
Yeah. So pretty light this week. A lot of the team was on vacation for the sprint. So we got about 10 PRs merged. Of those PRs, 2 of them were enhancements. Actually, 6 were bugs, and 2 were housekeeping items. The big enhancements we had is we continue to integrate in the new dialog user component, both with the service reconfigure and now with the custom button details. We fixed, from bug perspective, we fixed a major issue with provisioning with the custom dialogues, and a big shout out to Eric for that help, and various UI fixes. As for housekeeping, we updated the translations, and we updated all our dependencies as we do each sprint. And that is it for us. Next slide, please.
All right, so today I'm going to share some updates from the Azure, OpenStack, Red, Lenovo, Popular, and VMware providers. Next slide, please. So most merged pull requests this sprint came from the Kubernetes repo, followed by VMware and Overt, and then a sprinkling of merged PRs from the rest of the provider repos. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand it over to Adam, who is going to describe a new VMware refresh strategy that he implemented. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Bronagh. So this sprint, we merged a PR which essentially turns the current VMware refresh worker into an inventory collector in the same way that inventory will be collected in the rearch effort. So this is giving us a way to test out some of the methods that we're going to be using in the rearch in 5.0, but in the current release. So some of the things that this lets us do is it bypasses the Vim broker cache. So if you enable this feature, the inventory cache in the broker will be turned off, which saves a good amount of memory. It will parse and save updates as they're delivered from the provider, which ends up with a much faster time to update inventory objects compared to the current deliver an event, have it go through Automate, and then do a targeted refresh. This also uses VMware's RubyGem, so that we don't need to maintain our own hand soap VMware API layer, which is currently in the broker. In order to turn this feature on, it's currently a prototype, but this is the config that you would need to change to enable this. Once you do this, the refresh worker for VMware will actually load a thread, which will do a wait for updates collector. And if you want to check it out, the code is located under the VMware Info Manager inventory in the provider's VMware repo. Next slide, please. So I think we've seen this graph before, but just to underscore, the new method of doing refresh this way cuts the memory about in half, and it also cuts the time to do the first refresh about in half. And that's it. Next slide.
Thanks, Adam. All right, so for the OpenStack provider, support was added this sprint for targeted refresh for cloud virtual machines. And for Lenovo, support was added for some new power operations. So you can now restart a node into setup mode, restart a node controller, do a hard power off of a node, and a hard restart of a node. Next slide, please. So for the over provider, so a few sprints ago, we demoed the B2B support, but this was temporarily disabled while some blocking issues were addressed. So this was re-enabled this sprint, and graph refresh support was added. So for the Azure provider, the metric counter names configured in the diagnostic settings on virtual machines in Azure changed, surprisingly. And since we were pulling the previous metric counters, no metric data was being gathered. So this was quickly fixed this sprint. And this applies to CPU, memory, and disk. Next slide, please. So for the Hawkular provider, when adding a data source, the available JDBC drivers are retrieved from the middleware server. And if a provider is not running, an exception is now replaced by a descriptive warning message, and the user can close the wizard. A link to the underlying virtual machine has been added to middleware servers running in domain mode. And finally, exceptions have been unified in a new version of the Hawkular client Ruby gem. So the Hawkular provider has been upgraded to use this new gem. And so this reduces the number of exceptions that need to be handled in the provider. And that's it for providers. Over to Tina, who's going to talk about Automate.
Okay, good morning. This past sprint, Automate had 20 PRs merged, 7 enhancements, 12 bugs, and 1 technical debt. A few enhancements I'd like to highlight. Previously, we had finished the work for adding the Ansible service execution time to live, but initially the work was done early in provisioning. We found that it was more appropriate to do it later at the check completed stat. Ansible playbooks, we've added MIQ group to the ManageIQ payload in addition to the user. You'll see a theme over the next couple of sprints as we add MIQ group to various places, rather than having to get the group from the user in all cases. The ongoing work for generic objects. Work was done this time to limit generic objects associations to reportable objects. Next slide, please. Okay, a few bugs. There was a change made for quota this time. This is actually really important. So quota up until this point is only considered provisioned VMs. This change is a backend change that allows quota to consider in-flight service and VM provisionings, which is really significant because you could have tens or hundreds of provisionings that are going, and the quota could happily approve your request, and meanwhile you're severely over quota. So I'm excited about that. As I mentioned, MIQ group now is available in Automate, in addition to user and tenant, so you'll see more of that going forward. And there was an issue in custom buttons where the target resource was not available in dynamic dialogues. And that's it for Automate. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, Tim. On the platform side, you can see it was pretty much even between enhancements and bugs, and then smattering of things for the other categories. So I'll just talk about the highlights for enhancements and bug fixes. So on the custom button side, this is the back-end work that Dan was showing in his screenshots. That was all completed by Libor. We're also doing expression support for entitlements. The back-end work for that is complete too, so when the front end is done, you'll be able to configure an expression as opposed to checking off tags to make a filter for restricting the view of what a user can see in entitlements. And also, I think I mentioned this a couple sprints ago, but Libor did some of the front-end work to expose the optional average versus max calculation for allocated metrics on chargeback. I got a screenshot of that on the next slide. On the bug fix side, so Joe V's done some more work making the matching that we do a little bit more better. Just extending it so that we can, if we can't match a fully qualified DN, we try and match the simple name. So that would be just like the user ID when you log in. And this is also when we can't go to LDAP and look up the user object and get the groups. So really all we have is the fully qualified DN and what we have in the database, and we're trying to match that. LJ made a change. It's a small change, but probably decent size impact for queue workers so that they have proper amount of time to complete any active work before they get killed for exceeding any thresholds. What it was doing was it was given a 10-minute grace period to finish up its work when it hit a memory threshold. and he changed it to look at what, if it's actively delivering a message from the queue, he looks at the timeout of the queue and adds 10 minutes to that. So then it can finish what it's doing, and then if it doesn't exit after that, then it'll get killed. Also, a change was made. This is more for people with development environments. Do not try and start or stop Apache unless we're running on an appliance. If you're running locally in a development environment, that would actually blow up, and it was actually causing workers not to start up. And a fix was made on the appliance console to eliminate an error that was being seen when we tried to restart the network after setting a host name in IPv6. It was actually setting it, but there was an error, so it looked like it didn't work because the appliance console would blow up. So that's an important fix too. Next slide, John. And this is the screenshot. You can see here there's a new selection on the chargeback filter tab, method for allocated metrics. It was doing maximum, was the only way, the only calculation it was doing. Now you could do average. And I think that is important because you might have a spike of a maximum in the beginning of a period and then have it be much lower later on, and we get charged the maximum, so you can choose that. That's it for the platform side. Alberto.
Thanks, Gregg. So on the API side, we had a couple of bug fixes that came in. The one was fixed by Chen, where we would not be getting the report results because we were not specifying the user ID, so that was defaulting to system. So now that's being passed down properly for the authenticated user. Next bug fix was really bridging a gap with with the Classic UI. So when we create providers, we were not checking that credentials were specified, so that was not good at the bottom of the stack. So we now check to make sure that that's specified either the credentials or the connection configurations. That was done by Jelly. Next slide, please. Okay, so one request we had is that for the options methods, that was always, that required authentication to run, but as per the core's pre-flight requests, authentication is optional. So we do support both so that we're compliant with the core's standard. One thing though, for the container deployments, there is some sensitive information being returned. So for that, we made sure that, well, we don't return that information unless you're authenticated. So it would work with both authenticated and non-authenticated requests. And that's it for the API. Next slide, please.
Hi, for documentation in this last sprint, we had 13 PRs merged, 10 of which were enhancements and 3 were bug fixes. Among the highlights of those are we've added a description of debugging verbosity for playbook catalog items. We've updated Managing Providers Guide to clarify the workflow for enabling clusters. Updating appliances content was moved to the migration guide. We have a procedure for displaying reports in full screen, and we've removed some info based on customer feedback. That's it for us.
Thanks, everybody. We will see you in 2 more weeks on September 6th for the Sprint 68 review. Do we have any questions in the chat, John?
No.
No. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.